September 10th, 1999, the day after the US launch of Sega's new console, the Dreamcast. West Coast rapper Del the Funky Homo Sapien had just finished a gaming tin set at a San Francisco club. And now, Peter Moore, Sega of America's Senior Vice President of Marketing, stood on stage, ready to reveal the console's day one sales figures to the world. He lifted the paper flaps covering each digit, one by one. The crowd got louder as the millions stacked up. It roared as he flicked the last flap aside to show a total of nearly $98 million in sales. He declared it the biggest launch in entertainment history, and crucially, bigger than the US launch of the PlayStation and the Nintendo 64. It was, in his own words, a moment of euphoria. But less than 18 months later, Moore, by that point Sega of America's president, told an industry conference call that Sega was leaving the console business altogether. An 18-year era of Sega hardware, which included 4 of the best gaming consoles of all time, was over. Sega! It's tempting to blame the swift demise of the much-loved Dreamcast on something easy and obvious. Perhaps that EA refused to put its games on the console, or that the impending PlayStation 2 spooked all the prospective buyers. But it's clear that the Dreamcast death was complicated, messy, and arguably inevitable, even as Moore stepped onto that San Francisco stage. Moore joined Sega from Reebok, having never worked in games. His initial attitude to the gaming industry was that he was slightly pissed off, because he'd bought his son a Sega Saturn only for the console to be effectively abandoned by the company. But when he heard the Dreamcast's promise of online gaming, it was of course the first console with a built-in modem, he was sold.
Sega Dreamcast games are now online, unleashing the ultimate horror. Your fellow Americans.
Connecting people around the world to compete or collaborate in shooters, RPGs, sports games and brawlers would be the rocket boost for console gaming, he thought. And Sega had the chance to get there first. It led Moore to coin the phrase, "We're taking gamers where gaming is going," and that's online.
We believe the future of gaming is the internet.
The console had stalled in Japan since its 1998 launch, but Moore and others generated excitement for the Dreamcast in the massive US market with flashy ads, celebrity appearances, and, more fundamentally, a rock-solid launch lineup that includes Soul Calibur, the first 3D Sonic game, and NFL 2K. Within 2 weeks of launch, Sega had sold 500,000 machines in the US. That's the same number that Sony would make available for the PS2's monumental US release a year later. Moore's esoteric TV marketing, including the AI-themed "It's Thinking" slogan, "It's Thinking," had piqued the public's curiosity, and retailers were willing to stock their shelves with Sega's powerful, stylish machine, apparently forgiving the failure of the Saturn after many conversations with Moore and the other executives. Simon Cox, the former editor-in-chief of the official Dreamcast Magazine, recalls the feeling of the moment. After the complete lack of energy with the failure of the Saturn, which died a slow, horrible, fairly boring death a year or two before, the ambition was there for the Dreamcast. We had this magazine coming out, and they seemed to be putting a lot behind that. I think they did a good job generating some extra excitement. And that enthusiasm was reflected in the magazine's sales. Before long, official Dreamcast magazine had a circulation of more than 250,000, which put it just short of the widely read Electronic Gaming Monthly. But even then, during what might be considered Dreamcast's best days, seeds of doubt were sprouting.
Sonic will have to run pretty fast to catch Nintendo and Sony, but Sega's off to a good start there, having already pre-sold 300,000 of the Dreamcast consoles. The company hopes to sell 1 million units by Christmas.
Despite the initial excitement, Peter Moore wasn't fooled by the joy of launch day, saying, "It was very clear to me that this was just somewhat of a euphoric moment in time for us, but I knew that the real litmus test was going to be the following Christmas holidays." His biggest concern was bolstering a strong set of first-party games developed by a group of talented in-house studios with third-party titles.
Hey kid, how about a game? Game?
Shenmue and Phantasy Star Online, the first proper console MMO, were coming soon, but Moore knew that that wasn't enough. Anyone considering buying a Dreamcast needed to know that the big publishers were on board, ready to pump games into the console for many years to come. As Moore flew around meeting the biggest publishers of the time, Activision, Acclaim Entertainment, Codemasters, he spoke to all the execs who were hesitant. They were kind of sitting on their hands as regard to, when are you going to commit for your next game? What does the pipeline of Dreamcast games look like for the next 3 years? And there wasn't one.
Enough talk. Now get out.
Welcome to the third place.
PlayStation 2! The third place!
Sony had announced the PS2 at the Tokyo Game Show in early 1999, to be released in the following year. After the success of the PlayStation, a successor loomed over Moore's conversations, creating fear, uncertainty, and doubt, which Moore shortens to FUD, aka FUD, in everyone's mind. Sony's marketers did everything they could to FUD the Dreamcast, painting it as a transitional platform. Gamers and retailers were left in no doubt that while the Dreamcast was a good console, the behemoth is coming, and that's where you're all going to flock to. He suspects that Sony could also afford to pay developers to make their best games for PS2, but not for the Dreamcast. And Microsoft were, by this point, already having conversations about long-term deals ahead for the launch of the original Xbox, which would arrive in 2001.
For the first time, let me now unveil Xbox.
Moore was, therefore, stuck right between the track record of Sony and the American juggernaut Microsoft.
It is truly the future of video games, and I'm very excited to simply be a part of it if you smell what The Rock is cooking.
With a checkbook that you can't even lift off the ground, where does that leave Sega?
Its last home console flopped, and it's seen its market share plummet from more than 50% to about 1%. Can Dreamcast end Sega's nightmare?
People felt betrayed by the Sega Saturn, an expensive console that, as Moore found out with his son, did not get proper long-term support. This was, of course, in contrast to the earlier Sega Genesis, known as the Mega Drive outside the US, which had a long, generous tail. People had spent a lot of money to buy a Saturn, and then the games either weren't great, or there weren't enough of them. It was a lost generation, and as soon as those people knew a PS2 was coming, complete with a DVD player, which at the time was a sought-after $300 gadget, they weren't going to come back to Sega. Sega was therefore building the Dreamcast on unstable ground. It was trying to repair its reputation with retailers and gamers, while also launching the type of console that players hadn't seen before, and perhaps couldn't grasp the importance of.
Sega's new Dreamcast video game console is graphically better. The first home unit able to handle 128 computer bits of data at once. Twice as much as the Sony PlayStation and Nintendo 64 machines that dominate the $12 billion a year US video game market.
Sega successfully patched relations with retailers and generated excitement from the launch. But people who were reluctant to buy early began to ask, what's next? And Cox himself believes Dreamcast's It's Thinking slogan didn't help.
Soul Calibur on Sega Dreamcast. It's thinking.
It created curiosity, yes, but it wasn't a concrete message, and it wasn't enough to convince people who remember the Sega Saturn. Into that void of doubt rushed Sony, perennial entertainment winners promising an emotion engine processor that would properly move you. They were the big guys, and they had the money, they had the clout, and they had the advertising agencies. They had the emotion engine. They were constantly getting out there, and gamers were getting super excited. I think that's probably what cost Sega. In many ways, the sales of Cox's official Dreamcast magazine mirrored that of the console. It flew at the start and then stabilized. It found its natural limit, and the lack of long-term third-party support, which Moore was working so hard to secure, showed in the magazine, and Cox didn't have to worry about juggling dozens of games. Perhaps one of the reasons Moore was so keen to secure third-party games was his concern that the first-party Sega studios were slow to respond to broader industry changes, and he sensed a shift towards Western-style games, and this was a year before Grand Theft Auto 3 would become the best-selling game of 2001.
Let's teach these would-be tough guys what it means to be a tough guy.
Cox says that he felt it too. Something was changing. The center of gravity is moving towards the west from Japan. I don't believe that Japan suddenly ceased to exist and then it was all Doom, Tomb Raider and Grand Theft Auto, but certainly that center of gravity had moved between the two a bit more evenly, and I think Sega were caught in that.
I see nothing but good things for you, my boy. Anything you want.
more began to sound alarm bells. On trips to Sega's Japanese HQ, he'd fight, metaphorically, with developers about the future of the marketplace. But the studio heads were, as Moore says, closed-minded, closeted demigods. Undoubtedly brilliant, but also unwilling to conduct the kind of market research that would soon become second nature in the industry, and unwilling to adapt to a globalizing audience. They would never fly to the US to listen to gamers. There was a pretentiousness there, because these guys were rock stars in Tokyo. Everything that they had previously touched, for the most part, had turned to gold. Moore says in an ideal world, Sega would have instructed its creative directors and the heads of studios to do 3 months of market research and listen to gamers around the world before they even pitched a project. Moore hoped that they would have embraced the idea, but it never materialized.
You know nothing, fool! It's chaos! The god of destruction!
There was, I don't want to call it arrogance, but there was this belief that they knew what was going to be a good game and gamers didn't know. These were brilliant developers, really brilliant developers, but the closed-minded view was our downfall in the end. These frustrations would later lead to the famous conversation that convinced Moore to leave Sega, in which he was accused by Sonic co-creator Naka of doctoring market research footage. Moore told Naka to f*** off, a sentiment that a horrified Japanese translator refused to convey. I knew that Naka had spent a lot of time in America. He knew exactly what I was talking about. Whether a shift in Sega's development attitudes could have saved the Dreamcast, we'll never know. You get the sense of speaking to both Moore and Cox that there was an inevitability about the Dreamcast's impending doom. Bad timing combined with the irresistible competition from companies with far more money.
The graphics power is over 3 times what's been available before.
The bet on online gaming was admirable and showed foresight, but Phantasy Star Online, the Dreamcast's big MMO, was a full 4 years before World of Warcraft would explode the genre. As Cox recalls, people in the office were excited about it. It didn't quite seem to reach that level of being a cultural phenomenon that you'd expect it to be. I think all of that stuff was slightly ahead of its time.
For the first time, a video game system will allow you to play your opponent who doesn't even have to be in the same room, in the same city, or the same state. You'll be able to play online.
Dreamcast was also the first console to try DLC, which over the next few decades, to some controversy, would fuel many parts of the industry. Games like Shenmue, a semi-open world adventure, previewed popular genres before they got big.
Get out of my way.
The Dreamcast even had its own internet subscription service, SegaNet, a short-lived service which launched alongside NFL 2K1 for $21.95 a month. In the context of Moore's phrase, taking gamers where gaming is going, it turned out that Sega arrived before the gamers did. One of the problems being ahead of your time is you're also ahead of your audience, ahead of your market, and ahead of where your profits are going to come from. Moore says that he can't think of anything that he personally could have done differently to save the Dreamcast, or produce a better outcome for Sega. And if it had arrived later, it would have already been in the jaws of the PS2. It was felled by the double-edged sword of the growth of the industry. In the online gaming boom, somebody was going to miss out, and inevitably that was going to be the smaller player, not Sony or Microsoft. If the industry is going to grow to the level that it is now, that takes mega corporations to be able to fund that. I believed in online. I believed it was the future. We were taking gamers where gaming was going. We had amazing content, both first party and third party at launch. We had an unbelievably powerful and robust piece of hardware. But with the PS2 launch and then Microsoft coming into the market with billions upon billions of dollars ready to spend, it just wasn't going to work out.
The Xbox is everything The Rock is. Cutting edge, powerful, exhilarating, and like The Rock, it will be the most electrifying thing coming out this year.
It wasn't until Christmas 2000, more than a year after Moore climbed on the stage of the San Francisco club, that the console's fate was officially sealed. Up till then, Sega of America was hitting its targets, and retailers still believed in the Dreamcast. Moore awaited the hockey stick style leap in the sales graph, which dutifully arrived, but the numbers didn't jump quite high enough. In those days, retailers would report via telephone to you what their sales numbers are, and then you would build an Excel spreadsheet. When Sega punched in the Boxing Day numbers, the writing was on the wall. Sega was already making a loss on each console, relying on game sales to pick up the slack. By mid-2000, years of declining profits had turned red, and it was losing roughly $400 million a year.
Apparently, it costs more to make a Dreamcast than it does to buy one. In short, every time you shell out for a Dreamcast, Sega actually loses money.
I can go and beg all I like in Tokyo, but I know ultimately they're going to pull the plug. They cannot afford to keep hemorrhaging cash. They cannot afford to keep making these things at a loss, and they're not even selling. In the new year, Moore flew to Tokyo for a post-mortem and was told Sega was getting out of the hardware business. He was also told that on January 31st, he would need to chair a telephone conference call and tell the rest of the world.
Sega have recently announced that they're ending production of their most successful console to date.
Yes, it's checkout time for the Dreamcast.
It's a shame that the Dreamcast, with all its enigmatic ambition, had to end with an Excel spreadsheet and a conference call. This wasn't just the death of a console, it was the end of an era, and the world of gaming was losing Sega's unique hardware sensibilities. I do believe that Sega had an aesthetic and a way of looking at things that was, I think, quite innovative and a little bit different. There was something a little off the beaten path about Sega. They had the ability to surprise. They were a bit strange and idiosyncratic. They had a sensibility that came from their arcades, which was, let's try this. This could be cool. Oh, it needs 2 chips to work? Okay, put another chip in. There was a slightly Skunkworks vibe. They weren't as slick somehow. I do miss that. Moore agrees that the world at the moment was a worse place with no Sega hardware. You had a generation that grew up with these platforms and they were Sega fans. They're still around today. The Dreamcast will be remembered forever by those fans, and by developers who were around to glimpse the early potential of online console gaming. We can do MMO on console. Sega did it. There it is. Maybe that's the epitaph on the tombstone. Dreamcast. It showed what was possible. In the years to follow, online gaming, which was already booming on PC, would explode onto consoles. But the Dreamcast, sadly, wasn't around to see it. It takes somebody to stick their neck up over the parapet and go, online. That's where it's at. Well, you know what happens when you stick your head up sometimes? It gets shot off.
No. Father! No!
If you like this, why not check out our video on how the PlayStation changed everything. Another retrospective told by 2 former Sony presidents, Andrew House and Sean Layden. And for everything else gaming hardware history, stick with IGN.
Man, stay off the light speed!
My bad.